Hi guys. Today we are starting in John chapter 7. We are starting in verse 1 and going through verse 24. So this one is a lesson from Jesus on judgment. So we're going to see what Jesus has to say here. Beginning in John 7 verse 1, we find Jesus after he has just rebuked the bread-wanting crowd and taught his disciples their first lesson on communion, basically. And of course, they didn't take that yet, but it was just kind of like the precursor to what was coming. So he basically, after this, went back to Galilee, where he lived, I guess, and was trying to stay away from Judea, where the Jews were. And why was he doing that? Because, of course, why? They already wanted to kill him. And why did they want to kill him? He was doing good work, right? He was healing people. He was teaching people. And he had been doing good things. But they wanted to kill him. And so it's like, if a guy does wrong, they welcome him in and they love him and they keep him and they make him one of their own. But if a guy does good, they hate him. I wonder if they could be jealous. I think that might be what it is. So that's where Jesus is. He's kind of staying away from Judea. It's not really time for him to go onto the cross yet. He has more work to do in his ministry. He's basically just starting, and so he's really just trying to avoid this trouble that he knows these men are creating. And so at the same time, though, the Jews are gearing up for what was known as the Feast of Booths in Judea, where Jesus did not particularly want to go. Now, Jesus did keep all the feasts, and he did, he fulfilled the law. He was a good Jew, and he had to do that to prove who he was, really. And so, just to give us some background, though, what was the Feast of Booths? It was a time that the Jews were called to remember their time in the wilderness. Remember Moses when he delivered them, when God delivered them, I should say, but through Moses from Egypt. So it was a time for them to remember that wilderness time where they were just out there and they weren't at the promised land yet, to give thanks and to live in these temporary shelters for 7 days. So that's what they did. They would live in these tents for 7 days to remember that time. And the reason for the shelters was to keep them from the temptation, get this now, because this is for us too, the temptation of growing comfortable, fat, and happy in their houses after harvest. And so God wanted them to remember their time in the desert and how he had provided for them all their needs. Remember the manna? Jesus is the bread from heaven, guys. So this is actually, they're in the midst of remembering these things and how God was pointing them to a Messiah all along, how God had provided for them. And so it was just to remind them to not stop trusting and relying on God for all things, no matter how blessed they currently were. And so this is a time of great joy, of feasting and thanksgiving for the goodness, faithfulness, and the provision of God toward his people. So that's where we are. We're at the Feast of Booths. And so Jesus's brothers, his actual brothers, his blood brothers, begin to urge him to go to Judea and to do some more miracles. They chide him, in fact, for hiding his power. And they even disbelieve it because they themselves probably at this point haven't seen him doing all of these works. They've just heard about it. And so even his own blood brothers do not believe in him at this point, or who he actually is even at this point. They're kind of like, Jesus, why don't you go do some more of those miracles we've been hearing about, and why don't you go show your power among the Jews, right? So this is what they're urging him to do. But Jesus answers them at this point, and he says, it's not the time. Time's not right, guys. And he tells them the reason, and he won't go and do as they have said, because the religious men already hate him. They already hate him, and we've seen that a couple chapters ago when he did the healing at the pool. They already hate him for doing the signs he's already done. But truly, the reason underneath the hatred over the signs is the fact that his work, his good work, exposes their sin. That's the reason underneath the reason, right? So Jesus' good work of the gospel exposes the religious people's sins. That's what he does. And, it exposes all people's sin, really, but it's just that the religious people aren't used to being confronted with their sin. They're used to being the ones doing the confronting, right? And so they have this false appearance of perfection and piety, and they are just not used to someone showing them exactly where they're erring. And so Jesus is able to do this simply by doing the good work that he does, and they don't like it, right? And so they're trying to kill him. They got to get rid of this guy because he's going to show us up. People are going to start to think bad of us, and that's the last thing we want, because the thing that was most important to these guys was what they looked like on the outside, right? It wasn't what was in the inside. It was what people saw on the outside. That's what they cared about. So they got to get rid of this guy. And so therefore, Jesus says, this is why they hate me. And this is why they seek to kill me. In fact, that's why the whole world hates me. And why don't you guys just go to the feast? They're not going to hate you. I'm just going to stay home, right? So this is what Jesus tells his brothers. But so they go without Jesus, and then Jesus decides to go on his own in fulfilling of the law, I'm sure, and he goes quietly. He doesn't go with his brothers. He doesn't make a scene. He doesn't start doing miracles. Instead of busting in and bringing his miracles with him to the Feast of Booths, Jesus just kind of creeps in and kind of stays unnoticed for a few days. He's not trying to cause a problem, he's just trying not to get killed at this point, so it's not time for that yet. But the Jews are actively looking for him. They're looking for him, right? The townspeople are all gossiping about him. The text says, and there was much muttering about him among the people. So what does that mean? John 7:12. Some said he was a good man, and others said he was leading people astray. So there was much division about who this guy really was. But no one dared talk openly because they were afraid. They were afraid of the Jews. They were afraid of the religious people. They're like, we dare not talk about Jesus. Like, we don't want to get in trouble with the religious people. And what I see in that is something very sad. And it still goes on today. Don't think it doesn't. It does all the time. It really, really does. But these people that were at a religious feast at the temple, praising God, thanking God for his provision, remembering God, remembering the things of God, they're there to worship God. But what do we see? We see fear. We see people who so fear their religious leaders that they won't even say the things that they really think about a man who might just be the Messiah. They won't even say it out loud. They'll say it to one another in whispers. They won't say it out loud because they're afraid. And so the religious leaders of their day had created a culture of fear and oppression when they were supposed to be the ones creating a place of safety and encouragement in the ways of God. But when you're among a people or invested in a religious culture where open dialogue and critical thinking-based discussion is both feared and forbidden, which it often is, you're in a convoluted place of conspiracy rather than a place conducive to worship and spiritual growth. And we see it. In our culture, it's ubiquitous. Many places, many places, there has been a culture of religion created to the point where anyone who questions, anyone who has a different idea, anyone who wants to debate or discuss anything that dissents from the status quo is seen as problematic, threatening, just not welcome. The overarching theme is you are not welcome here because we're not going to talk about that. And we're the leaders, and you're just a person. So don't let us see you talking about things that only we're allowed to discuss. And if you do, we're going to find a way to get rid of you. And that's what they did to Jesus. And that's what they will do to you. Many places, many religious places operate in this fashion. And it's the same now as it was then, unfortunately. It's a sad thing. So what does Jesus do in this kind of culture, though? Jesus waits until the feast is about halfway over, it says. For them, this was likely about 4 days in. It was a 7-day feast. So maybe day 3, day 4, Jesus goes up to the temple and he begins to teach. And we can infer from the text that Jesus has really got his stuff straight, right? And we knew that anyway. But this guy knows what he's talking about, right? Jesus can teach rings around these religious guys. He can teach on the scriptures like nobody's business. He's like no one they have ever seen or met. So much so that these men literally marvel at them. It says they marvel at him because of his teaching. They marvel. They can't believe. They can't understand how this guy can teach the way he can without ever having formally studied in the same ways that they have had to do. Jesus hasn't gone to seminary, guys. Like, he doesn't have any real mentors or strict formal, like, accomplished studies that he's had done. Like, he knows things because he has discernment, and he's probably studied much on his own. And of course, he has the wisdom of God. But these guys, they don't get it. They don't understand. Like, how can this guy know these things? How can he have this kind of wisdom and authority? Jesus was a carpenter, right? He was a carpenter's son. He hadn't been, studying with them all these years, but yet he knew these things. And they knew what it took to be able to teach the way that he was teaching. They understood. They knew how hard it was to discern the way that he did. And they probably saw an anointing that they had never seen before. And so much so that they marveled. They marveled. So they listened. Did they listen and they learn? Did they sit up and take note of what he was saying? Did they welcome him and sit at his feet when they saw these things? When they were marveling at how he taught? No, they didn't do those things. And in fact, they did the opposite, right? Jesus, in his great wisdom, begins to correct them. He told them that the way that he taught was not of his own will, but God's. He told them that he came not on his own authority, but the Father's. He assured them that if any of them were truly seeking to do God's will, they would automatically know that the authority that he had was of God, and the words that he was saying and the lessons that he was teaching were of God. If they were seeking to do God's will, they would have known that. It would have been very obvious. And he even mentions Moses, and he reminds them how they failed to keep the law. Then he asks them a serious question. All right, so Jesus, it's his turn to ask the questions, right? And so he says, why do you seek to kill me? Well, that's an interesting question, right? You're teaching about the scriptures and the law, and then out of nowhere, you say, why are you seeking to kill me? What? I mean, imagine that for a moment. You're the most religious person that you know. You are. You and all your friends are squeaky clean on the outside. You've never said a cuss word. You've never been to the bar. You've never eaten a pig. You've never shaved your beard wrong. You've never worn the wrong clothes. You've never worked the wrong job. You've never ran with the wrong crowd. And you've never worshipped the wrong gods, at least not where anybody has seen you, right? And so you are, by all appearances, absolutely perfect. And you like it that way. You like the affirmation of your pretend perfect friends. You like the power that you possess for being the pretend perfect leader that you are. And you are in love with your position as this person who gets to pick who's in and who's out in your religious games of pride and pretense. That's who you are. And then this guy comes along, and he is just absolutely perfect, right? He comes along and he's doing the works of God. He understands the scriptures. He's able to teach rings around you. He has compassion. He's extremely generous. He's a spiritual policeman. That's what he is. He comes along and he starts to prove himself by his right doing and his amazingly wise words. He has authority, and he hasn't even studied like you have. He possesses something naturally that you have had to spend years painstakingly studying to obtain. He has great power, and he begins to expose what is underneath all your pride and all your pretense. So he's in a word, he's able to make very plain your own darkness in sin. He pushes over your tables where those you have chosen to place in the temple are pilfering for personal gain. He pushes them over. He is so generous, though, that he gives the best wine to anyone within the wedding feast, to a whole party full of people. The best wine. He's so good that he heals a broken man on a day that you say that he shouldn't even be doing business. He generously gives bread to a huge mass of people. He defends himself without apology in the face of your false accusations. And on all accounts, this man is absolutely perfect. You cannot find fault in him. And so what do? You start making some stuff up. That's what you do. But the only real problem here is that you hate him. You seethe with anger and pride every time he comes into your temple because you do think it's yours. You don't understand that it's God's house that Jesus is frequenting. You can't believe you have to put up with someone who's so difficult. You're jealous, you're insecure, you're full of hate, and you're steeped with pride, so much so that you and your friends quite literally are actively trying to seek ways to do away with him. That's what they were doing. I mean, it's crazy, but that's what they were doing. So you want to kill him, and you, who by all appearances and all that your life's work has accomplished, has put on a face of perfect propriety, but you hate this actually perfect man so much that you literally want to kill him. You, who pretend to be absolutely perfect, are plotting a murder. And so that's where we are. And Jesus knows it. He knows it. He feels it. He knows it. He discerns it. And you know what he does next? He calls it out. He calls things what they are. He calls them out on their pride and their pretense. And he very pointedly asks them, why do you seek to kill me? John 7:19. Now that's quite a question. It really is. And how do these perfect by appearance people respond when someone accuses them righteously of the very things that they are doing behind everyone's back? They do the only thing they can do. They call him a liar. They try to save their almighty reputations because that's what matters to these guys. They do not examine themselves for their sin or error. They say he has a demon. They pretend he's possessed. They call him crazy, and they point to the fact that not one of them would ever possibly even consider doing such a sordid thing. But the only problem here is that these guys are not being honest. They're not. They're playing stupid religious games, and they're about to get stupid religious prizes. Jesus calls them out again. Hey guys, remember when I healed that guy at the pool? Remember how you pigeonholed that poor man that I healed? Remember how you persecuted me afterward about healing on the Sabbath? Remember how you said I wasn't the Son of God and I told you how I was? Remember how you wanted to kill me then? Well, I wanted to ask you something. What about when you guys circumcise your kids? Don't you guys still do that? Don't you do that on the Sabbath if you need to? Oh, like you mean you're not perfectly following your own man-made laws? You mean you allow for personal things to trump your own religious days and the same days that you fault me for healing on? Last time I checked, you guys were doing the very same things that you're seeking to murder me for. That doesn't make sense to me, guys. You care more about your kid being circumcised than you do about me making a man wholly well who's been suffering for so many years. How is it that you judge? Can you just explain that to me? What kind of judgment is that, guys? All you do is look at appearances. All you care about is what's showing on the outside. Why don't you start judging things rightly? Why don't you stop passing so much condescending judgment on me and start seeing things with some more compassionate eyes? Because that's what I came for. Stop being so shady, right? Learn to do right. That's what Jesus is teaching them here. Learn to do right. That's what Jesus wants. And you can hate him for his truth speech all you want. But his words came not from himself, but from the Father. You know, the guy you say that you worship. And if we preach and teach from the Word of God today, our words are wrought with great authority as well. We have the authority of God if we're teaching from his Word faithfully. And so it isn't our own authority, it's his. And so if anyone wants to argue or take it up, they should take it up with him. The authority belongs to God the Father. So we just need to remember how Jesus responded when he was hated and abused and persecuted by the most religious who cared only about appearances and not about people. And that will give us great wisdom in our own situations where we face this kind of persecution. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you guys have a good Thursday, and I will see you tomorrow, continuing in John chapter 7. Have a good one.